Dr. Keith Sutton, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Oh, thanks for having me, David.
And I should say welcome back because, in a way, we had an interview years ago. I don't remember when, but in my other podcast that I did for a few years, that was called Wise Counsel Podcast. And that's become kind of inaccessible. And so we said, well, let's do it again. And so I'm really glad to have this opportunity to speak to you again.
Yeah, it's so great. Yeah, that podcast was back in 2009. So it's so nice to talk to you all these years later.
Yeah, and your career has moved far along from I think where it was back then to a really impressive place that we'll be talking about here. Well, if you're ready to jump in, maybe you can give us a thumbnail sketch of your background and how you came to specialize in family therapy. But first, let's talk about your own family of origin.
Okay, sure.
Tell us about that.
So I grew up in Connecticut, in Norwalk, Connecticut. My parents, my dad was a plumber, my mom was a bookkeeper, and they divorced when I was 6 years old.
Okay.
So we grew up in a middle class kind of family, situation in Norwalk there. And actually, in seventh grade, I was asked to write a report on what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I thought about it, and I really enjoyed talking, to friends about their problems and kind of helping them. And I was interested in the way the mind works. And there was also a TV show called Growing Pains, where the dad was a therapist. He worked at home. And I thought,
Uh-huh.
great. So I wrote a paper on becoming a psychologist when I was in the seventh grade.
Wow.
And basically got on that track ever since, and was the first in my immediate family to go to college. So yeah, that was kind of my path.
Yeah, yeah. Some similarities there. Me too. Also came from a working class family, and I think I was the first in my immediate family to go to college.
Mhm.
Um, so we share that bit of history there.
Yeah.
I was curious. It doesn't sound like you experienced family therapy. I thought maybe you got hooked on maybe your family went to family therapy and maybe that's how you found out about it and got hooked on it.
Yeah, no, they actually went later on with my little brother, and actually is extremely helpful. The way I got into family therapy. So I in grad school was, or sorry, in undergrad, my interest was working with teenagers. And so I assumed I'd be working with teenagers individually, doing individual therapy. I hadn't even really conceptualized a family therapy. And I worked at a teen shelter for adolescent girls who have been taken out of the home due to child protective services. And then also at a residential treatment for adolescent boys who are sent from all over the country who, were in a treatment program for aggression. And I work with them, just separately from their families. But when I moved from Denver, where I did my undergraduate, to Santa Barbara, I worked at a teen shelter there, and we'd have the kids, they'd come in, and then about a day later, we would meet with the kids and their parents. And I quickly learned that when you put the kids back in the context of the families, a lot made sense, both their strengths as well as some of the maladaptive patterns. So I got really interested in family therapy and, kind of working with children, adolescents, and families. And that was kind of my focus going into graduate school.
Yeah, and interestingly that you were working with kids so early because when I interviewed you before, back when did you say it was? 2019?
2009.
2009. Uh, we spoke about your work with oppositional kids,
Mm-hmm.
and so that was fascinating. And so in a way, you've stayed on track and just deepened your work. So tell us a bit about your training too. You have
Sure.
an incredible amount of good training.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
and,
it's a funny story. I tell this when I do my trainings, because I kind of, really had to learn in those areas where I felt like the approach that I was using didn't cover. So before grad school, I actually moved up to the San Francisco Bay Area and worked at a drug and alcohol treatment program for adolescents. And so that was very systemically oriented. So going into graduate school, that was my focus. I had also done some training in motivational interviewing early on. And so
Uh-huh.
the kind of postmodern client-centered approach was really stood out to me. So I ended up doing training in narrative therapy, and I had a great narrative supervisor. I did a training with Michael White when he was alive. I also did
Yeah.
a training with another postmodern therapist, Insu Kim Berg, who did develop solution-focused therapy. And so I really enjoyed that work, and I liked the aspects of collaboration and the therapist taking the one down approach, and a lot of the transparency that's involved with that approach. But I quickly
What
learned,
do you mean when you say the one down approach?
so one down approach, so particularly that the client is the expert on their own experience, and the
Okay.
therapist brings in their experience, but that really we're kind of honoring the client's knowledge and experience and kind of bringing that together
Yeah.
rather
Yeah.
than kind of the kind of one up approach, which is more the therapist is the expert and the client is there to listen and learn or take the therapist's interpretations or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And a lot of people who come into therapy start out with that assumption
Mm-hmm.
and really will put you on the throne and you have to work to educate them to get off the throne, right?
Yeah, and it's really, it's really a collaboration between the therapist and the client. And that's
Yeah.
one of the great things I learned from motivational interviewing. One of the biggest takeaways that I got from that was that resistance is not necessarily something that's within the client, but it's something that happens between the therapist and the client. So actually, when we hit that resistance as a therapist, it gives us a clue that there's something that's going on that we may be doing to evoke that. So really kind of being able to back it up, understand our client, gets a place where they feel like we understand, and then we can move forward. Because really, the alliance is the basis for everything. The common factors research has found this. Um, I
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to get introduced to Scott Miller and Barry Duncan's work
Yeah.
back early in my career using the outcome rating scale and session rating scale. And one of the things that they found is by getting feedback on your sessions,
Right.
they could increase outcome by 65% regardless of theoretical orientation, because therapists tend to overestimate how good the therapy is going and overestimate how good their alliance is.
Yeah, I actually had the privilege of hearing Scott Miller in person
Mm,
years ago, and was
great.
so impressed by what he had to say that I also followed up with one or two podcast interviews. So
Oh,
people
wonderful.
people will find him. But yeah, very creative
Hmm.
guy. Brings a lot of creativity to his work.
Yeah,
And one of the things I found myself wondering is how, given that you came from a working class family, having looked at your recent work where
hmm,
you're training people in family therapy
sure.
and in and a variety of approaches to family therapy that we'll get into, um, I'm impressed by your work ethic. You have an ethic of hard work.
Yes, yes.
Where the heck did that come from?
Gosh, when I was 12, I started a paper route and, ended up buying out a couple of the other paper boys in the neighborhood and creating a
You were an
conglomerate.
entrepreneur already.
Yeah. And then I used to work summers. My grandfather run a printing company, and so I'd be doing the big old huge blueprints through the
Wow.
machine. Worked at a camera store, a grocery store. I volunteered, did all sorts of stuff, and I worked all through college and worked two jobs after college because to work at a teen shelter back then, it was you only got paid like $8 an hour. So I had to work another full-time job as a waiter to basically be able to live. But I really loved the work with the clients that I was working with, and so it was worth it. But yeah, no. So I've always been. I was joking with my supervisor because graduate school felt like a little bit of a vacation because I actually just got to just focus on graduate school and not having to work two jobs at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, wow. That's a really fascinating history.
Yeah,
And one of the things that well, we're going to skip around with a
sure.
variety of,
Well,
of
and
questions here.
David,
Yeah.
if I could jump in, because the I did that training in narrative therapy and more the postmodern. But then I quickly learned that if you're gonna, that I'm a little too directive for more of the postmodern approaches. I'm from the East Coast. I kind of go very quickly. So I ended up gravitating towards structural strategic family therapy. And I did some training in brief strategic family therapy with Olga Hervis from University of Miami. I also got trained in attachment-based family therapy, Guy Diamond's model for depressed adolescents. Vicariously got some multidimensional family therapy training from my supervisor who was certified. Did some family-based therapy for anorexia training from Kara Fitzpatrick at Stanford, training in emotionally focused family therapy. And I was at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto with the strategic family therapy team.
Yes, yeah,
I quickly learned if you're going to work with a family, you need to know how to work with a couple because oftentimes the parents were really struggling. So I ended up getting trained in Gottman method couples therapy and then also emotionally focused couples therapy. And I went on to get certified in EFT, and I'm one of the handful of EFT certified supervisors in the area. So the family work was going well and the couples work was going well, but I didn't really have the tools for kind of say, working with panic attacks or so on. So I ended up actually deciding to dive into cognitive behavioral therapy because my minor in undergraduate was in Eastern philosophy. And the idea of the way that our perceptions color our experience really spoke to me. So I ended up going out to the Albert Ellis Institute and doing some workshops with Albert Ellis when he was alive.
yeah.
The Beck Institute in Philadelphia, did some training with Judith and Aaron Beck when they were alive, or when Beck was alive. Did some training with Edna Foa in exposure with response prevention, training with Robin Walser in acceptance commitment therapy, did some DBT training. And along the way, I also got trained in EMDR. So I integrate the family systems, the EFT, the EMDR, and the CBT into my work. And kind of my kind of overarching grounding isn't working systemically. And then actually in the last several years, I've really dug a lot deeper into working with complex PTSD because
Yes.
the couples, the families that I was working with where they were kind of working with me the longest term, I realized that actually the common factor was complex PTSD. So I dug deeper into that area. Pete Walker's wonderful book, Complex PTSD, Surviving to Thriving, did some training in internal family systems with Dick Schwartz, did a training course with Janina Fisher. And so really kind of digging into more of the kind of structural dissociation models. And so that's kind of been my path to where I am today and really integrating
Yeah.
together.
What a path. And I think our audience will better understand my comment about your work ethic.
Yes, yes.
Because just the way that you went after all of these different approaches
Yeah.
to get as fully equipped as you could
Mm-hmm.
is quite remarkable. And you know, uh, one of the things that you pointed out, well, I want to start off and ask you, what do you see as the special strengths of family therapy?
Yeah. So, and I want to actually even comment on this aspect of family therapy because I think oftentimes when people think of family therapy, they think of just the parents and the kid kind of talking together or so on. But systemic thinking goes beyond just the family or the even kind of nuclear family that we think
Hmm.
about. So, as a systemic thinker, you're thinking about how all these different interactions are playing out. So, I might work with an individual adult, and then, like one client, we worked through her panic attacks. And as we're working more, there was some traumas. We did some EMDR work. And then I thought, you know what, I can either work on this attachment in our relationship in kind of a psychodynamic way, but instead, actually, let me bring in her partner, her husband, and actually work with her current attachment figure. So we shifted into emotionally focused couples therapy to really strengthen the relationship. And as we, helped make improvements there, then actually during the pandemic, a lot of the stuff started coming up. So we did a little of the family therapy work and helping her be an attachment figure to her daughter. So, with the systemic thinking, we can kind of move in and out of individual to couples, couples to family, and so on, and really kind of help create this larger shift. Because in systemic thinking, we make small changes in different areas of the system,
Yeah.
get these big impacts because we have these kind of reverberating, kind of ripple effects. And there's a lot of people that do family therapy, but are more of an individual thinker. So they are doing, say, individual therapy with a child or a teenager, and then they might occasionally bring the parents in and kind of help support the teen or child in talking to the
Yeah.
parents,
Yeah.
which is very helpful too. Although as a systemic thinker, my goal is to really put myself out of a job and really to help that system change. So not just being the advocate for the child with the parent, but really helping the parent to learn how to draw the kids out and helping the kids feel that comfort to be able to talk more in Guy Diamond's attachment-based family therapy model, which originally was developed in working with kids who had just attempted suicide. Basically, the question was, when you're feeling so bad, can you turn to your parent? And if not, what gets in the way? And you help prepare that adolescent to talk, you help prepare the parent to listen, and then really can choreograph these moments of connection. And when
Yeah.
the kids have that ability to really turn and have that strong attachment, then their depression, their anxiety goes down. And I actually think about it, it was actually from a podcast that you had done years ago. One of the people you were interviewing, she talked about some EMDR work she was doing with some kids and families, and she said it was almost like two magnets that were polarized, just kind of turning around and locking in. That in that kind of session, or what I call a stage 4 session in Maya and Jim Kime's model, that's a 4-stage method. That when we're able to help the kids get really vulnerable, really help the parents hear and understand, then it's like all the kind of defensiveness and so goes out the window, and they just show up for their child in such an incredible way.
So much of your current career is involved in training other therapists
Mm-hmm.
in these approaches, and
Mm-hmm.
and you're doing the training. A lot of the training is online.
Mm-hmm.
You've created pretty much standalone, and you privileged me to be able to look at one of your courses, which I really appreciated, so
Yeah,
I could get a better idea of where you were coming from, what you were doing these days, and so it makes me wonder uh, how much of if you can put a percentage on it, how much
sure.
of your time is spent online doing therapy training
Uh-huh.
versus how much is done with families these days.
Sure. Sure. So actually, let's see. So I am doing about 34 hours a week, and about 32 of those are with clients. And so the training, I actually have a group supervision that I run weekly. I have actually two aspects of my practice. I have my Institute for the Advancement of Psychotherapy, which is our group practice of licensed experienced folks. And then we also have our associated nonprofit, Bay Area Community Counseling, where we have our associates, MFT, LCSW, and so on. But the rest of the time is working with clients. Only about 25% of the clients that I work with are children, adolescents, and families, because I like to be home for dinner with my own kids. If I could, I would have 100% of my clients. But about 25% are couples and about 50% individual adults. But of all of those clients, about 95% I've worked with their system at some point or another.
Yeah, with the system, and that's fascinating. We really wrestled with how to name this interview. I needed a
Yeah,
title, that I
yeah,
could draw people in with, and we kind of went back and forth on that. And originally, I thought, well, let's focus on those oppositional kids that we talked about
yeah, yeah.
years ago. And one of the titles that you suggested more recently really, and I can see why, because you wanted to get everything into the title. And so that title contained breaking the rules of therapy, moving between individual, couples, and family therapy with the same clients by working systematically. So
Yeah.
I felt that was awkward for a title for the show, but at the same time, it um, it encompasses all these influences that you're integrating in
Hmm.
in your work and your trainings, and so let's stick. Let's draw down a little bit from that
Sure.
title. You
Yeah.
refer to breaking the rules. What are the rules that you're breaking? What are you referring to there?
Well, and I think that they are more kind of mental rules that many therapists have, that you
Okay.
can't say, do couples work with somebody that you've been doing individual therapy with, or you can't say do some individual therapy with a parent of a family that you're working with. And particularly, there's no rule against that. You have to, of course, be aware of dual relationships and the effect that may have on, confidentiality and how open, and really kind of making sure you've got all clear consents around that. But particularly, it's more out of a individualistic perspective. When there's more of a, say, a psychodynamic where there's a frame of the therapy, and you don't want to necessarily break the frame because your client is,
Yeah.
projecting the transference onto you, then you can't then bring in another part of the system. But in more of a systemic approach and systemic thinking, you can move in and out. I've, worked with lots of different combinations of clients, and we talk about benefits and risks of kind of, say, bringing in a partner to do couples therapy after doing individual therapy. They might lose that individual outlet, and everything we've talked about is going to be open. There's no secrets in the couples therapy that I do. Rarely have I had anybody that said, no, I don't want to do that. They're like, no, I'm happy to share this with my partner. And ultimately, what we're trying to go for, right, is to create that openness and that connection.
Hmm.
Or many of the teenagers I work with, in that first session, I oftentimes ask them 0 to 100%, how much do you feel like your parent understands you? And they give me a rating or so on. And I say, and if they understood you more, 90, 95%, what would that be like? Almost always they say, wow, that would be great. We'd fight less. They'd be less
Yeah.
hard. We'd get along.
Yeah.
And that idea of that connection is really kind of what we're going for there. Um, so yeah, so I think that that's a big piece.
Yeah, and so that's kind of we don't need to expand everything in that title, but um, there is you mentioned a behavioral approach, and that's one aspect. Yeah, and from listening to the show that my allegiances tend to be in humanistic, transpersonal,
Mm-hmm.
um, human potential areas, and but I've been impressed by some of the behavioral stuff that some of my guests who come from a
Yeah,
behavioral point of view have broadened my narrowness in terms of my own thinking.
yeah.
And
Well, and
so, so you want to talk about in what ways is your approach behavioral?
sure. So one of the ways I conceptualize the therapy is in 5 phases. So the first
Okay.
phase, assessing, figuring out what's going on. The second phase is first order change. So that's where we're just trying to stop the bleeding, decrease the anxiety, the depression, increase the functioning. The third phase is that second order change. So there's a term in systems theory, the idea of kind of changing the system so things don't just slide back, a month after therapy or
Yeah.
whatever it might be. So on an individual level, this might be internalizing some of the CBT tools. I might do EMDR at this stage to do some of that bottom up processing. Or we might go from individual therapy to couples therapy and bring in the partner to really create that change that's going to be lasting. And then in the fourth phase, that's maintenance. So that might be one session, that might be a number of sessions. Basically, does a bump in the road, set things back, or are things going well? And then the fifth phase is relapse prevention, kind of wrapping it up. So in that kind of second phase where we're creating that first order change, oftentimes that's when I'm going to use, say, exposure therapy for panic attacks. Or I do a lot of work with adults, children, and adolescents with ADHD. Actually, 50% of my practice comes to me regarding ADHD, which is a specialty of mine. And a center within our institute is called the Bay Area Center for ADHD. And so for many of the clients with ADHD, we're first starting out behaviorally, time management, organization, just getting to the sessions on time, and not, and helping make sure they're not losing their jobs. And once we get some of that stability, then we can go much deeper. And that's where we're using the cognitive behavioral therapy, oftentimes working on shame, which is one of the central features for many adults with ADHD. We might do some exposure because actually there's 45% comorbidity between anxiety and ADHD in self-referred adults in one study. And oftentimes, not only is it hard to get going on things because there's the distraction, but there's also the avoidance. So we might do some exposure. We might then bring in a partner. There's all these kind of different things. We might do some EMDR around some of those early traumas, um, whether big T or little t. So these are kind of the different ways that we're working. And the behavioral interventions, and I can talk about kind of our four-stage approach for working with children and adolescents. I'll talk about kind of the oppositional if you like. But this idea of using kind of these behavioral interventions to help the person get stabilized, increase their functioning. And the way I think about it is we're kind of helping clients go from bad to good to great. So that aspect of like you're talking about of kind of actualization, connecting with one's values, going in the directions of one's values, and really creating a fulfilling life is so important. But sometimes we need to kind of get out of the chaos and the crisis of the week quickly, so then we can actually kind of have a foundation to build upon.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that what you're doing is a radical integration of valued approaches, and instead of getting locked into just one mode, that you're really covering the waterfront and integrating and being flexible. Uh,
Mhm.
and so I'm wondering, and one of the things I was struck by is, I was thinking, well, let's talk about your book, and
Mhm.
and you don't have a book, I
I don't have a
gather.
book yet.
And I can understand that you don't have a book because you're so busy doing all of this
Yeah.
stuff. So I'm wondering, it seems to me that that you would appear to be well poised to be in a major leadership role in the field.
Hmm.
And so I'm wondering, uh, what's your sense of how influential you've been able to be, given that you don't have the book?
Sure, sure. So, particularly, actually, I made a decision way back, actually, right around when we had talked, that I really wanted to look at how I want my life to be. So, you were mentioning about kind of all the training and such. The first year I renewed my license, you're supposed to get 36 hours of continuing education. I counted up, I had 320 something hours.
I
So I
can
did
believe
all
it.
this training, and then I had my children. And I kind of had that decision point of, am I going to write a book? Am I go do, talking and things like that, different conferences? And I decided I was going to really kind of focus on my family, my kids, and then later on, if that was in the cards for me. And actually, the Institute, I was at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto. And
Well, let me just interrupt to applaud
yeah,
you that that you decided in favor of walking the walk rather
oh,
than
yeah.
just talking the talk. That you said, "Wait a second, I'm having a life here. I'm building a family." You know, and there have been family therapists who had no families.
Yes,
One
yes.
of the most influential people in the field was Virginia Satir.
Hmm.
And I took workshops with Virginia Satir back in the day, but she had no family. She spent all of her time traveling around the country and the world
Hmm.
training people.
Yeah.
Yeah, so good for you.
Yeah. Well, there's a
And
lot of people I know that are family therapists that don't have families for whatever reason. I've got one person I know, their family because of infertility, another one out of choice, but they also have their extended family, their uncles or aunts or their nieces and nephews and so on.
yeah,
But sometimes they don't have their own children. But yeah, yeah, for me, I always wanted to be a dad, and so that was I was always excited to have kids, and that was
well,
really good.
how many kids do you have and what are their ages?
I have two kids, 13 and 9 years old. Um,
Okay.
and I always joke that, I'll have been working with teenagers now for, oh gosh, 25 years. And I always said, as soon as I have a teenager, it's all going to go out the window.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
um,
you
but
haven't hit that famous stage of pretty severe testing
Yeah,
that can
yeah. Well,
happen.
we're getting there.
Yeah,
With every developmental level, we need to be flexible. And actually,
yeah,
an aspect of systems theory is that when the system gets rigid and there is a developmental period, and the parents don't become flexible and kind of create a new
yeah.
way of being, then we get stuck. So we're in that process of really, finding that.
And if I may continue to be personal, are you
Sure.
also married or coupled up?
I am married.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm actually so this is my second marriage. I had gotten divorced some years ago and then got remarried. And
So that gives you some authority about that because a lot of your clients are going to be in that process of having been married or getting divorced, etc.
well, and also to getting into a relationship. I had been with my first wife since I was gosh, we met when I was 21. And doing all this work and learning and so on, I got it, but I didn't quite really get it. And then going into a relationship later on as an adult, I just got it so much more. And
Yeah,
the ability to learn how to be completely open, connected, to communicate, like, and I thought we had communicated in my first marriage, but not to the level of what I've really understood now. And it's really helped me, not only my wife and I have a really strong connected relationship, but also, really in me helping the couples that I work with.
right.
And oftentimes, sometimes they'll get to a place where it's kind of good. I'm like, it could be better. And so really kind of helping them because I know what that is like and that kind of
Uh-huh.
and also how to get it, which is nice. And the EFT is just a perfect kind of modality to get there. Yeah.
The EFT stands for,
Oh, sorry, emotionally focused couples therapy.
okay.
Johnson's work that's
Yeah.
based on attachment theory.
Okay. Yes. Attachment theory. Yeah. Well, you have that was on my list of things to talk about. Say a little because attachment theory seems to have really come into its own,
Oh yeah.
and it's so important. And we understand attachment now, not just from a psychoanalytic point of view, but a neuropsychoanalytic point of
Mhm.
view. We know about attachment systems in the brain and so on. So this has been a really hot area that I've just been very excited to be on the sidelines of.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's so important. And actually, I was working with a couple where I was using some of my, Gottman level one training with, and I ended up doing the training with Sue Johnson and Scott Woolley in EFT. And I brought my couple down to do a live demonstration. And it was like night and day. Like in the work we were doing, we were just skimming the surface. And this really got to the heart of the matter in what Scott was able to do in just this one session. And it just sold me. It just made
Yeah.
sense. And really for the couples that I work with, the way that I conceptualize attachment is that to the extent that the other is responsive, whether to talk about our bad day, talk about the thing they said that upset us, or for the kids to, talk about what's going on for them. Um, and then also to the extent that we feel loved, accepted, respected in the relationship. When those two things are there, things are going well. When they're not there, we tend to get into these patterns or these cycles where we're usually trying to do the thing that makes most sense to us to either gain connection or prevent distance. But sometimes it's the opposite of what the other person needs. So we end up going back and forth in these, what we call in EFT, these cycles that end up drawing us, kind of moving us farther apart. And so in EFT, we're really identifying those cycles, slowing it down, helping the clients turn to their partner vulnerably. And then in that stage two work, really do that rebonding work. But I mean, the way I think about it, attachment not only it makes sense, of course, in relation to couples or children, adolescents, and families, but also with our sense of self. When I was at the Beck Institute, Judith Beck had discussed some of Aaron Beck's writing and how he talked about all automatic thoughts boil down to feeling helpless, hopeless, or unlovable. And it really struck me because the couples I was working with, when their partner was not responsive, they felt helpless, they felt hopeless.
Mhm.
When they didn't feel loved, respected, valued, they felt maybe I'm actually unlovable. And so I thought not only do we relate to others this way, but also to our sense of self.
Yeah.
And I've been doing a lot more training in parts work and IFS, internal family systems, and this idea of kind of our responsiveness to the different parts of ourself.
Right.
And so not only is kind of attachment the way we relate to others, but also to ourself and as well as the world. When there's been trauma, for example, the world does not feel responsive. It feels out of control. So that's kind of one way. And then I also think about in our therapeutic relationship, there's also that attachment, and not necessarily in a, needing to reparent the person in more of a kind of analytic way, but more, does our client feel like we're responsive? And do they feel not necessarily that we love them, but that unconditional positive regard, feeling valued, respected? And when we have that good attachment, and we can even get that beginning in the initial phone call. And actually, that outcome research, the Scott Miller and Barry Duncan, I think about that in attachment terms. Because at the end of the session, as the client's giving feedback, they might say, "Gosh, I felt like you didn't understand what I was saying about my mother." And I could say, "Well, let me write that down. That's really important. I want to start off at the beginning of the next session." Or I might say, "You're right. I don't think I was conveying how betrayed you felt." Hopefully that client is walking away feeling they've experienced me as responsive and that I'm valuing and what they have to say is important. So they're not walking away going, "Oh, he didn't get me today," but more feel like, "Oh, there was a miss, but it's important to my therapist that he gets me." So again, that kind of idea of that attachment and feeling understood
Yeah.
and safe.
Now you've been talking about systems, and that makes me think about the larger systems that we're embedded in.
Mm-hmm,
Uh, um, in the U.S., the political systems,
mm-hmm,
the 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 splits that are happening in our culture.
mm-hmm,
Um, this is a difficult time to be an individual,
mm-hmm.
let alone to be a family. And so, how is that cross-cutting your work?
Yeah. Well, in we always have to think about kind of the multiple levels of systems. Uh,
Yeah,
I mean, particularly, in the areas of culture, around issues around privilege, around racism, sexism, genderism, all these kind of aspects are affecting our clients, as well as the dynamic between the therapist and the client. Also, right, looking at kind of the movements that's happening in the culture with the news and how that's affecting clients and increasing levels of anxiety, increasing animosity. There's all these kind of aspects that, is a kind of a beyond the scope of this discussion, but right, like the way that even the agencies are changing and needing to get clicks, right? Because there's less newspapers, so they have to say things that are inflammatory, and it's not
right.
just reporting the facts, but more what's going to have that
Yeah,
emotional impact on the person to
right.
get them to click on that. And so we've got a lot of, and also, what's happened in the culture too, around a culture of mistrusting experts and so on.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really wreaked havoc in our political system and our kind of organizational structures, and so on. But really kind of looking at those multiple levels of systems is so important because it all applies.
Yeah, it does all apply. And in a sense, you're swimming against that tide of and and so it'll be interesting to see as time goes on how you're able to navigate some of the changes that we're all being
Yeah.
challenged by.
Well, and a systemic thinker is always thinking about context
Yeah,
and how that context is affecting the individual. Um, I forget if I heard Phil Zimbardo, who did the Stanford prison study experiment,
yeah,
asked, and as he was talking about it, he added something I'd never heard before. He said, "You know what? Stanley Milgram actually grew up just only a few blocks away from him. They didn't know each other." But he
huh,
said, "What
yeah,
was it about that neighborhood in the Bronx that led these two people to go do this profound research on
right,
systems?" And so just kind of on context and how that affects people. And so it's just interesting what was going on in the context of that neighborhood in New York that led these two people to get these ideas and go on to this incredible research.
Yeah, just maybe you can give us a thumb. I'm not sure how much our
How
audience
familiar?
is up
Yeah.
on these people. So maybe give us just a quick uh,
Yeah, yeah.
the prison experiment by Zimbardo and how would you care and the
The experiments on authority, yeah, with Milgram.
authority, yeah,
So,
authority,
so yeah, the
Milgram's
prison
experiment.
study, basically they, took a bunch of college students and made some of them the prisoners and some of them the guards. And they actually assessed them all that there was no kind of psychological issues or so on. And what they found was actually they had to stop the experiment because the guards were becoming sadistic and being abusive towards the inmates and so on. And so just again putting them in that context led these people that were just kind of everyday students and so on to be acting in this way. And in Milgram's experiment, they were kind of looking at how the person responds to authority. And there was a person who was a doctor and telling the test subject to kind of turn up a dial, electrocuting another test subject. The other test subject was an actor and there was no electrocution going on, but the idea was that maybe, it was kind of looking at Nazis in Germany and maybe they were more susceptible to authority than Americans or so on. But what they found is that most of the people turned up and just kept following the person of the study, the doctor, until the point where some of the people were passing out and the actor was acting like they were almost dying and they passed out and were not responsive, but people kept going. But the point is that when we go into a context, it really has a significant effect. And these people, again, assessed for being kind of normal, no particular issues, that they ended up acting in these very abnormal ways because of the context. So,
Right.
as the systemic thinker, when working with kids or adolescents, I want to be thinking about, what's going on also in their interactions with their parents. How are they affecting their parents? How are their parents affecting them? Going a ring out, looking at their relationships with institutions, schools, churches, also going out farther, right? Looking at socioeconomic status, culture, immigration status, all of these kind of aspects are playing in to what we're seeing in the room.
I think it's instructive to help us be less judgmental in the sense of realizing that we tend to think in absolutes of this person's good, this person is bad, but
Mm-hmm.
really, what was how did they get that way? What
Yeah.
were the cultural and familial influences and so on? I
There's
want
also
to, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to add one last piece to what you're saying there. It's called the attributional bias. And
Yeah.
my colleague Jim Keim, who used to be the clinical director for J. Haling Fluid developers of strategic family therapy, when he'd teach with me, he'd bring up this example that a comedian gave. Said it's like kind of like driving on the highway. Whoever's going too slow is an idiot, and whoever's driving faster than you is crazy. Um,
Yeah.
that
Right.
idea that it's all relative, and particularly the attributional bias is that we apply a trait to another person. That's an angry person. But to ourselves, we apply a state. Oh, I was just angry because X, Y, and Z happened because of the context.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. I want to make sure that we have that I give you plenty of opportunity to set your wares out on the table and let
Sure,
people know about all the various services and courses that you're offering, and
sure.
so that people who want to learn more or who want to get training can know about what's out there.
Yeah, definitely. One, and maybe I can speak to kind of one of my main areas that I'm interested in, of course, as we talked about, is families, and particularly my highest interest is good old, out of control adolescence. And that's what kind of led to our first interview on oppositional defiant disorder. Um,
Yeah.
and so I originally mentioned I worked at teen shelters, kids running away, drugs and alcohol, all that kind of stuff. And so I ended up actually connecting with Jim Keim, who had done some work on a 4-stage model with oppositional defiance disorder. And we ended up pairing up together and working together and kind of developing that model into a transdiagnostic model. And so the way that we work is that, so kind of conceptualize this in 4 stages. which maps onto those 5 phases. But the first stage is assessment. So meeting with the teenagers or the kids and the parents and kind of finding out from everybody what's going on. And a lot of people say, oh, it's so hard to do family therapy. It's hard to get families in. I actually never use the term family therapy because I just can't quite do it any other way.
Uh,
And what I tell the parents on the phone is I just kind of explain what we're going to do. And they're like, of course, that makes sense. And I want the parents in there for that first session to find out, everybody's perspective and find out who the resources are, right? Because the parents are the resources. So meet with them all together, meet with the kids for a little bit, parents for a little bit, bring them all back together with a plan. The second stage is the preparation stage. So in an externalizing situation, we are meeting with the teenager, getting to know them, finding out what's going on. Many kids that are oppositional say, oh, there's no problem. It's just my parents. So we say, great, what can we change with your parents? And go with that energy. And then with parents, we're teaching them some skills for co-regulation and really kind of helping them to get out of those escalations with their defiant child or teen. Jim Keim actually talks about kind of what we call the process orientation, that for kids that are oppositional, they tend to be more process oriented than outcome oriented. And one way of kind of giving this example is that, say if somebody went to a Japanese tea ceremony and they thought, gosh, I'm going to get some quick tea, and it's more about the ritual and the process, so they'd be very disappointed. So for kids, of course, they want what they want, but when they can't get what they want, if they're in control of the process, there's some sense of control. And so they tend to be controlling of the timing. Either you got to do this now, or I'll do that later, or the direction. You go to talk about A, they start arguing about B, you get into it about B, it all blows up, and then you're like, wait, what happened to A? I asked them to clean up the room, they started arguing about their sibling, and then it all blew up and the room's still dirty. Or the third one, which is the mood. The parent comes in with one mood, child comes in with another mood, and the child pushes the buttons to determine the parent's mood. And so part of what we're doing in that second stage is really helping to understand that conceptualization and helping parents to kind of shift from kind of being bulls locking horns with the kids to more being like the bullfighter that can step out of the way. And this work is that second stage then sets us up for the third stage, which are your behavioral interventions. So these are your typical rules, consequences, rewards. And the way that we do this is we ground it in the family's values, because oftentimes kids feel like parents are parenting by mood rather than values. Mom's in a good mood today, so she lets me, have my phone. She's in a bad mood, she takes it away, rather than it be connecting to the kids' behaviors and what's happening, or the family values. And the third stage is after the second stage, because if the parents and the kids aren't getting out of those power struggles, the rules and consequences just become another opportunity for power struggles. So once we get that third stage going, then there's some more containment, things are less out of control. The parents are feeling better and feeling more empowered, which then sets us up for the fourth stage. And that's the one that's based on the attachment-based family therapy for depressed adolescents, Guy Diamond's model. And so we're helping give parents tools to get the kids talking, drawing them out, and getting the kids to express themselves directly rather than acting it out. And at this point, because things are less out of control, then oftentimes parents can show up. If we don't have that structure piece first, then the kid will say, oh, it always felt bad when you were yelling at me. And the parent says, well, what else am I supposed to do? You wouldn't do your homework. But after we've got some structure and they have some tools for getting them to do the homework, then they can be able to say, oh, tell me more about that. How did that feel when I was yelling at you? And what is it like for you now? Stage 4 is also kind of what one would think of kind of as a more typical family therapy, these deep kind of connecting conversations. But if they don't have oftentimes that structure piece, they might have a really good connecting conversation, but then a week later, the parents screaming, yelling at them about the homework, and the kids feels like, oof, I shouldn't have trusted that things could be different, and they put another brick in the wall. And for many folks that do individual therapy and then bring in the parents and aren't working systemically, oftentimes they might have some of these experiences where they finally prepared the adolescent to talk and they share, but the therapist hasn't built a relationship with the parent. So the parent's either feeling ganged up on and they might get
yeah,
defensive.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then the therapist determines, oh, that parent's not ready for family therapy, or or the parent will show up and say all the right things, but then afterwards things will fall apart. And the next week the teenager will say, oh yeah, well, they were just telling you what you wanted to hear. And so it's really a lot of that kind of preparation work and setting it up, and really that strong alignment with each party in the system that helps us choreograph that moment where we can really help the child or adolescent be vulnerable and really help their parent to really kind of lean in. One family I was working with, the daughter was sharing about, or the dad was, he was from Mexico. He was very kind of a machismo guy, and he was trying very hard. He was doing good. He was like, "Tell me, how does that make you feel?" And his English wasn't his first language. And the daughter said, "Well, I feel really bad because I don't feel like I'm your little girl anymore. I know that it was my fault for smoking marijuana and such, and I feel bad, but it just feels so bad because I'm no longer your little girl." And the dad turned to me and said, "I'm going to speak to her in Spanish." I said, "Go for it." And he turned to her, spoke to her in Spanish. The tears started coming down from her eyes. And I said, "How was it?" And she said, "Good." And I said, "What did he say?" And she said, "He said, no matter how old you are, even when you're an adult, you will still be my little girl. There's nothing you could do to ever make that go away, no matter how bad or whatever it might be. You'll always be my little girl." And for him, right, it was seeing her in that pain, that vulnerability that just kicked in that attachment instinct to just show up and go from kind of fumbling through trying to talk about emotions and so on to just leaning right in and letting her know how important she was to him and
Yeah,
how he,
that's such a good story. It tugs at my heartstrings just
yeah,
hearing that story.
yeah.
Yeah.
So this we're going through those stages 2, 3, and 4, all in that second phase, first order change. So we're going through that in about 10 to 12 sessions. And then what we're doing is we're tightening things up from there. So one way to think about it, there's one axis of the hard side of the hierarchy, the rules, the structure, the consequences, the rewards. And then the other axis is the soft side of the hierarchy. Who's in charge of soothing whom? Who's in charge of good things, good times, nurturance, guidance? Who can handle the hottest topics? And we need both of these for the child to be able to trust the parent and feel like they can be taken care of. And oftentimes when they don't have that trust, they feel like they have to kind of take over.
Yeah.
So and handling the hottest topics might be the kid being able to talk about the divorce or talk about their gender identity or talk about their trauma with their parent. One of the things we do is when we're working with a kid with where we've got trauma, we're oftentimes working up to helping them talk about with their parent, which some might think, oh my gosh, like, no, you have to do individual work and keep it all private and boundaries and so on. But again, when the child can turn or the adolescent can turn to their parent and their parent can hear them, one family I was working with, really caring family, but when the daughter would talk about her trauma before we started therapy, the mom would start crying and she'd say, well, what do you want me to do? And walk away. And so this was additionally traumatizing over and over because when she would turn to her mother for that care and support, her mother, it was too overwhelming. So I did some work with the mother and the father to help them get grounded, to be able to work through their own guilt, to then be able to show up and really have her be able to turn and be able to hold that. So we want that kind of hard and that soft side of the hierarchy. And on the other axis, we have the parental subsystem, and then we have the child subsystem. So with the parental subsystem, the idea is we'll get through these kind of 10 to 12 sessions, and then we might need to tighten up one of these. I kind of think about it's like kind of putting a tire on a car. You don't tighten one of the bolts all the way down. You get each one kind of going as you're
Yeah.
going, then you tighten it up. So you might have to say tighten up the hard side, some of the structure, because they've got that soft side pretty well. Or the couple you might do some couples therapy with them, or things are tightened up with the hard side, soft side, the couple's doing well, the parents, and then we might go deeper with the child. We might do some EMDR. We might do some exposure therapy if we're working on something like OCD or whatever it might be. The internalizing approach. So when we've got a kid that's coming in with anxiety, depression, or so on. So in the second stage, we're introducing. So the way I do my CBT is I do kind of a little almost Gestalt exercise. I have the kids and adults kind of act out like the devil and angel on the shoulder, those automatic thoughts leading to the anxiety or depression, and kind of bringing in that other side. And so I'll have the kids do this, and then I'll do some education with the parents around anxiety or depression. Also around accommodation, there's some great work by Ellie Lebowitz at Yale, who's actually created a program that only works with the parents and has been found to be as effective as individual CBT with children and adolescents, but it was developed with kids that were not ready for therapy or avoidant. Um, he's got great research. So doing some education around that, kind of understanding the accommodations, then having some sessions together and helping the kids then talk about, kind of show that exercise to the parents, because I want the parents reinforcing the CBT at home and having a way to help and kind of hear the kids' anxiety and talk about it. And then I'm also going to switch the parents and have the parent talk about what happens for them when they see their child anxious. Because the research has found that when you've got a child or adolescent with anxiety, if the parent also has an anxiety disorder, it's not treated, it's much higher likelihood for relapse. So vicariously, I
Yeah.
also want to be working on the parent's anxiety.
Yeah.
And like one family I'm working with right now, the mom's like, I think I need some of this there because the daughter is doing well now. And she's realizing that she needs a lot of that. In the stage 3, we either might not need some structure because the kid's doing homework, not acting out, all's fine. Or we might need some structure, particularly like with ADHD kids, kind of time management organization. Or we might be doing some exposure, like with OCD, doing some exposure with response prevention and kind of creating a behavioral intervention there. And then ultimately, we're leading up to then the stage 4 of really helping the kids talk about the depression, the anxiety, whatever it might be. And again, having parents show up. I'll give one quick example of one kid I was working with who, when he was in middle school, his dad got really upset. He took off his belt, and dad had grown up in South America. He had immigrated over to the US. He had experienced a lot of abuse. He never wanted to be that way with his children. He took off his belt, but then he didn't do anything. He stopped himself and he went away. But that day, that moment, the son, it really changed his feeling of safety with his dad. And so he became withdrawn. A couple of years later, he ended up getting depressed. So in that attachment session, he was able to share this with his dad. His dad was in tears, saying, I feel so bad that I never wanted that to happen. But then the kid, when I was meeting with him individually, was still having some of that reactivity. So we did some EMDR. And then we did more family sessions, having him talking. And so both processing on that bottom up level of EMDR, as well as on that systemic level through the attachment relationship. Because like one family I worked with, the way I think about, one kid, he was feeling like he was a failure. And I had him turn to his parent, talk about that. And his parent was able to say, gosh, you're not a failure to me. I love you. You're so important. I get on you about your grades, but you're not a failure. Through that attachment relationship, we're going to affect that core belief much more significantly than, say, a thought record of looking at the evidence for or against being a failure. So we can kind of utilize these experiential interventions or these attachment relationships to create those more kind of lasting shifts.
Yeah. I'm blown away by the complexity of everything that you're saying here. It's like you're a juggler who's got all these balls in the air, and yet you're talking about 12 sessions and what you're going to be able to accomplish in 12 sessions. So
Yeah.
to me, that's really remarkable.
Well, and
And
then, yeah, we're about 12 sessions to get it in place. And then we're tuning up those different areas over the next several, usually about, I say average about 20 sessions for the family
yeah,
work.
uh-huh.
Um,
And when you're learning this stuff, when you're in graduate school or you're maybe in a workshop like the ones that you're teaching, uh, the group processing, the supervisory process,
mhm.
where all of this gets discussed. Do you have anything? Do you have a group that you can clinic with
uh, so
still while
you
you're
you just set me up for the last part here.
okay?
I'll do the quick story because I know we're almost out of time. So I was at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, and I moved up to Marin, so the drive was quite long. So I decided to start a one-way mirror with my client, my colleague Jim Keim, and so we were doing a one-way mirror training with teenagers and families. And then I hired on another trainer to do a one-way mirror in cognitive behavioral therapy, and then another trainer to do a one-way mirror in emotionally focused couples therapy. And the trainers and I really enjoyed talking about cases and research and keeping each other up to date. So we decided to create this group practice, which I named the Institute for the Advancement of Psychotherapy. And from there, we were all fairly established, had our, kind of offices and stuff. So we created this kind of hybrid practice where we would use our own offices, group practice, private practice clients all on the same day. And then we would come together to talk about research, workshops we've been to, and talk about cases. And so it was really great because all of us were kind of trainers and really, kind of all learning together. And so that was in 2009 that I had started that. And so we've got a great group of folks. I think we've got 18 clinicians now. And it's really all clinicians who love learning, who really like to integrate and kind of develop and are always, keeping up on the different things that are going on. I actually started a podcast myself, part inspired by you and loving your podcast, called Therapy on the Cutting Edge, because there's
Yeah.
so much to learn and I don't have enough time to read all the books. I started
Yeah.
interviewing folks and kind of hearing, kind of interviewing folks that are doing kind of things that are innovative, integrative, on the cutting edge. And so I've got that group. And then I mentioned our nonprofit. We also have our nonprofit Bay Area Community Counseling, where we take on associates and interns where I'm training them in these four approaches of CBT, EFT, family systems, and EMDR. And so in our institute, I do these workshops that you are mentioning. And I actually, we do a CBT workshop in the fall, EFT in the winter, and a family therapy one in the spring. And then each summer we do a summer intensive. So we do 1 day, 6 hour CBT, 1 day, 6 hour emotionally focused couples therapy, 1 day, 6 hour family therapy, 1 day, 8 hour EMDR introduction. And then the last day, it's 2 hours on child therapy, 2 hours on motivational interviewing, and 2 hours on ADHD assessment and treatment. And people can take one or more of those workshops. They're open to licensed folks, to grad students, or they can take the entire week. And all the folks in our nonprofit, they go through that entire week to get that basis in all these different theories. And then weekly, we're in group supervision. Everybody's videotaping their sessions. So we're looking over videos and I'm giving feedback and suggestions,
Wow.
helping
Yeah.
develop those skills. And actually, I just recently in September launched the Family Institute of Berkeley, which is part of our nonprofit, Bay Area Community Counseling. And in the MRI tradition, we've got folks that we're doing one-way mirror trainings. We're doing those over Zoom. And it's been great. We just did one with Terry Suhu in the fall here, who is the head of the Strategic Family Therapy training program at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto. And then we're doing one in the spring with Karen Schlanger, who is the head of the brief therapy team. This is kind of one of the original Paul Watzlawick, Dick Fish, I'm blanking on John Weekland, kind of systems working. And that one-way mirror training is just so great to see it live and to be
Yes.
able to give suggestions to the therapist to help out with the family, and the family having a whole team that's helping them out. So, and
Right.
with being on Zoom, we can also be available different time zones internationally and so on for other therapists who are wanting to learn how to work systemically like this.
Where can people go to find out about this rich treasure trove of stuff that you've been talking about? Is
Sure,
there
sure.
a master website that where they can drill down and
Yeah.
find all
Well,
this goodness?
there's my website, which is drkeithsutton.com, drkeithsutton.com. There's our Institute for the Advancement of Psychotherapy, which is SF, like San Francisco, IAP.com, like Institute Advancement Psychotherapy. And we've got a lot of workshops also on demand there. And then the other one is our nonprofit Bay Area Community Counseling, sf-bacc.org. And then finally, the Family Institute of Berkeley.com. So there's a number of different organizations there.
Yeah, really. Oh my goodness. Um, Dr. Keith Sutton, is there anything else that you haven't had a chance to say that you need to squeeze in here?
One last piece. I'll give a plug for the Association of Family Therapists of Northern California, which is an organization of MFTs, LCSWs, PhDs, PsyD, MDs, nurse practitioners who all work with families. And it's the oldest family therapy organization in the world. And we have conferences. We also have free 2 hour workshops on different topics of family therapy, some in person, some on Zoom. It's one of the least expensive kind of membership organizations to be involved with. But I'm past president. I'm also on the board currently. but that has really been my clinical home for years. A lot of great folks there. And I think just the last words is just think systemically. That really there's a lot of tools that once you kind of can move from individual thinking to systemic thinking that are in your toolbox, and a lot of great ways. So also too, you're not kind of just alone with it, that you can bring in all these resources that are within the client's world, the resources within themselves, the resources within their systems that can really help to lift them up and help them get better. And so yeah, I would definitely encourage kind of learning more about it if you haven't. I know there's not a lot of training out there in systems thinking or family therapy or so on. So that's why we're trying to kind of fill some of the gap there.
Yeah, well, thank you for all of these resources that you've referred us to. And Dr. Keith Sutton, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Rap Radio.
Thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.